Welcome to Cool Explorations.
Last week we looked at poverty in the middle class and how they relate to Canadians. Now we are going to take a look at a subject that ties into these previous articles. Unemployment directly affects poverty and homelessness, so it bears taking a further look at. In Canada, our governments could be doing so much more to help this problem out, both federal, provincial, and municipal levels of government. Before getting into solutions, though, we need to take a look at the facts and the stats that are surrounding unemployment and Canadian history in general. Gives us a kind of guideline around this. So one site that you could find good information on this is tradingeconomics.com. They have some really great information in regards to the subject. They describe the unemployment rates as the number of people actively looking for a job as a percentage of the labor force. In other words, this means that it is measuring the amount of people who are able to work, who are of age, and yet are still unemployed. In Canada, this includes 15-year-olds. In a lot of other countries, it doesn't. Most recently, October 2019, showed Canadian unemployment rates at 5.5%, which has been fairly consistent since July, just bouncing back and forth between 5.5 and 5.7. Canada did see a loss of 1,800 full-time positions, but then they got replaced with 14,300 part-time positions. This seems to be a trend that's happening around the world now. Canada is bad for this. They're replacing full-time jobs with part-time jobs, which means that more people have jobs, which leads to a lower unemployment rate. But it also leads to lower paying jobs, meaning that these people are going to have to work more than one job in order to get by because they're not getting paid as much, nor are they getting the hours that they need. So it just means that because they're taking lower paying jobs, it's going to bump up the poverty rates for struggling families and make family cohesion is going to be a little bit worse because families aren't going to have time to spend together because they're out trying to make a living so they can support their family. Since 1966, Canada has averaged an unemployment rate of 7.62%. In December 1982, this was at its highest rate of 13.10%, which was due to policies and economic decisions made down in the United States. The lowest rate recorded falls in at 2.9% of unemployment rate in June of 1966, which means that our current rates are below average, but it does vary across the country and across job sectors. Canada saw drops in the manufacturing, warehousing, construction, transportation areas, but they got significant increases in jobs around administrative, finance, insurance, real estate, rental, leasing, and around the agricultural sector. We also saw differences based upon age. Ages 15 to 24 saw no changes, but ages 24 to 55 years, those workers dropped in unemployment. While those aged 55 and over increased in employment, not quite the shift that I was expecting, but considering the manual labor job loss, it is not really a big surprise, I guess, that unemployment would rise in the middle age group and decrease in the older age group, as the older age group then is targeting part-time positions. Same with a lot of the younger people have been targeting that while they're in school or students at high school and college and university. If we look at Stats Canada, we can see how these rates are dependent upon the province and territory that one lives in. As of the summer, the stats were as follows. Nationally, 5.7% was the average. The provincial breakdown would be BC at 4.3%, Alberta 6.7%, Saskatchewan 5.2%, Manitoba 5%, Ontario 5.2%, Quebec 5%, New Brunswick 7.2%, PEI 9%, Nova Scotia 6.5%, and Newfoundland and Labrador is 12.4%. These numbers vary depending on how diversified the province is in their economy. So Saskatchewan has a lot of different natural resources, from agriculture, uranium, wind power. Of course, we've got the potash mines, we've got oil and gas. Like, there's a lot of variety here. Alberta tends to rely a little bit more on the natural gas and oil and gas sector, which is why their stats are a little bit higher. And Newfoundland and Labrador, well, that would be because they have a lot of people who do leave their area for seasonal jobs. The Maritimes do definitely rely on seasonal jobs, and they end up with higher rates depending on the season because of it. And others of there will leave the provinces to go work in other provinces off season, which can create some problems, but people need to work. In territories, we see the Yukon with 2.7%, Northwest Territories with 7.3%, and Nunavut sits at 14.1%. Yukon has more ocean access and the ability to help in the BC and forestry fishing jobs, so that helps lower their unemployment rates. Whereas Northwest Territories and Nunavut, they don't really have that option. They're far more spread out than most provinces and territories in terms of their population base. So it ends up making it harder for them to kind of get to these different sectors, and increases the unemployment stats and numbers. And so poverty is extremely high in a lot of those Inuit communities. A good way around this issue is for provinces and territories to diversify their economies, so that when one commodity does crash, they will have others to fall back on. Compared to other developed countries, Canada ranks middle of the pack in unemployment rate success. Switzerland leads the pack with 2.2% unemployment, which is fantastic. And South Africa comes in at the bottom with 29.1%, which reflects poverty rates in these countries. If we look at Stats Canada, again, we can take a closer look at some of these things in terms of poverty rates, that kind of stuff. I encourage you to go and take a look at that yourself in there. I don't really have time to go over it, and I have covered it in a previous article. I'll have a link in the actual article. If you go to my blog, you'll see that I'll have that in there. If we then take a closer look at the situation with the territories, conferenceboard.ca has great reasoning behind their issues. They claim to have two factors that are behind the higher national average unemployment rates. One is that of the southern workers travel up north to take higher paying jobs that may take a lot more skill, but they do not stay to live there. So they're taking jobs that people in that area maybe could have done. The same problem is seen in the west with workers from the Maritimes. And the second comes in the form of economic expansion. This has pushed more people from the north to search for jobs, but not all will be able to locate a job, which results in more unemployment stats. And Yukon, thankfully, has avoided their issues, maintaining one of the lowest unemployment rates in Canada. They do also provide information on how unemployment rates can vary depending on immigration status. So in 2018, those born in Canada had 5.2% unemployment rates, whereas newly landed immigrants were at 6.1%. Immigrants landed less than 5 years were at 9.4%. Immigrants landed 5 to 10 years were 6.4%, and immigrants who have lived here for more than 10 years are sitting at 5.3%. So you can see when they're here for a long time, they tend to start lowering those rates. They will start getting jobs in different sectors. I do have an issue with these stats, though. First of all, immigrants who come to Canada need to be able to support themselves and should not be relying on taxpayer dollars to keep them afloat. If they're coming over, then they need to be able to work. These numbers that they do simply just raise our country's unemployment stats. Secondly, if they can't maintain a job in Canada, then they shouldn't be allowed to remain in Canada. And this isn't a race thing, it isn't bigotry, anything like that. It's just, we have a lot of homelessness and poverty in Canada. So getting those people back to work should be our priority, rather than having immigrants come in here, taking those jobs, and then not even maintaining those jobs. They will shift jobs, or they themselves will become unemployed, and then we'll end up supporting them and their families, which is not really fair to our citizens who have been here for a long time. So to me, if they're not a citizen, then they should be able to be shipped back if they cannot work, because they need to be able to support those who truly need the help. And we need to be able to help those that are true Canadians at this point. During Stephen Harper's time as Prime Minister, the country did fairly well economically, with the exception of the 2008-2009 recession, in which Canada was hit far less hard than what the United States was. Our unemployment rate hit 8.3%, but since we seemed better prepared, Canada was able to not be struck as hard as what the United States was. It was bleeding jobs, up to a total of 2.6 million jobs, according to CNN Money. Too many lost jobs in both countries, but Canada's preparation helped the country to rebound quicker and to help other countries try to rebound, which says something for the leadership we saw during that time. However, long term in the US, they have been able to recover due to lower unemployment rates, having their US rates drop down to as low as 4.9% since then. Canada has been able to recover in a short amount of time after this, though, mainly due to quick thinking by Stephen Harper, who was able to get a trade deal in place with China, which did shorten the recovery period that we were looking at, although some might say China is a terrible trade partner to be supporting. Then when they moved forward in 2016, we see Justin Trudeau is in power, and it's his second year as Prime Minister. The rates dropped again, and this has a lot to do with failed promises. So harmful bills and failed projects. One such failure would be the $4.5 billion purchase of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which then got sidelined by the Vancouver area and environmental protesters that blocked it from going through, and they had it held up in court. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld their claims, preventing the pipeline from going through, which some would say Trudeau didn't really want it to go through, but that's speculation. And this was according to the Huffington Post. Another threat would come in the form of Bill C-69, which makes a lot more red tape being put in place for any future pipelines, making it harder for any of them to go through. So it's been deemed the pipeline killer, according to Global News. Kenny in Alberta, he has been one of the ones pushing that title. The purchase and failure to proceed as planned with the pipeline to the BC coast, and a bill making it difficult to complete oil projects, made it really tough for the West, and cost many jobs and a lot of money in all the Western provinces. Alberta got hit the hardest, of course. Atlantic jobs were affected by this as well, though. And another factor in this was a struggle to recover after the oil price crashed in 2014, which has taken years to try and rebound from. A struggle that still shows today, hindered further by federal environmental laws. To further read into this, check out conferenceboard.ca. Unemployment rates due to economic crashes like in Alberta can cause a spike in poverty and homelessness rates, which we have seen in the West. I won't get into that topic too far, though, as I have done previous articles. With, like I mentioned, I've got 2 links here in my blog that I'm putting in, so if you want to just read the article in there, you can find those other articles on there, or you can just search my YouTube channel there and do the foreign aid money in Canada. And as well as Trudeau considering supplying Vancouver with drugs. I will say that in 2017, StatsCan placed 3.4 million, or 9.5% of Canadians, below the poverty line, which isn't a very clear line, as there seems to be a lot of ambiguity in there. Right now, they do consider $25,000 a year for a single adult to be poverty. And anyone making below $40,000 as a family is considered below the poverty line. Otherwise, they're in that lower to higher middle class, depending on where they are, which seems a little low to me, because it is still a struggle to get by at $40,000 for a family. So I think that could really be a little higher. To me, that seems like a way for them to kind of make their stats seem better than they are. Wages tend to play a big role in this, especially since so many people are having to work two jobs to make a living with the part-time trend. And because that has made it really, really hard. It's become so much more pronounced now. The average wage for a Canadian is $25.55, but this can be a hard stat to set in with salaries that are there, self-employment, farming, and contract work, so that number is not necessarily all that accurate either. When looking to set up a policy around employment, a lot of factors must be considered, as there will always be some unemployment, largely in part to people moving around to find jobs and shifting between workplaces or a changing career. Canadians tend to have the highest rates of moving between cities and provinces to move to a labor mobility. According to conferenceboard.ca, the goal that should be kept in mind for policy setting is to motivate all eligible workers in Canada to find a job, no matter where the country that or county that they are located in. This should be a big motivator that they need to be getting in place. Find some way to do that. When families and locations have longer periods of unemployment, it does destroy and tear apart families and communities. So these periods need to be acted upon quickly. This has been the situation in the West, and the Prime Minister Trudeau has not followed through on promises to help the West fix this problem that they have, as he promised in his October speech. The West supplied thousands of jobs for Eastern workers in their oil boom, but when the government policy destroyed this market and the Easterners flooded back east, an option that the Westerners were left without. They didn't have the option to just flood east to go and find jobs. They had their places that they're all settled in. CBC estimated that these workers were accounted for like 20%, or between 1,700 at some points, all the way up to 10,000 at some points. Yet the East has then criticized and hindered their progress to try to recover and diversify in the West. Quebec especially has been guilty of this. Another factor that could be looked at is technology. When new tech hits the market, it often cuts out jobs, leading to a spike in unemployment. But then as people receive training for this new tech, those rates will drop again. As people get jobs working in and with the new technology, it does create short-term unemployment spikes, followed by longer-term employment spikes. There are times, however, when new tech actually destroys the sector and takes it over, resulting in devastating job loss rates that will really be hard to recoup from. It'll be a struggle. So when implementing new technology, caution must be exercised to avoid unemployment because of technological automation. When an area has low unemployment rates, employers will struggle to find employees, and wages are going to be higher, making it harder for employers to get by. Higher wages can also boom the housing market, making it harder to buy a home due to inflation. Can areas really control this though? On one hand they could, but should they? A boom does have to end at some point, oftentimes with a crash, rather than the preferred gradual decline, which a crash can be devastating, but being able to provide jobs for a longer period of time is important, meaning that preventing the boom is counterproductive. The best way to deal with the situation is to diversify and find ways of bringing in other economic opportunities while the boom is on. That way, when the crash does happen, as it's going to in any sector, the area has other sectors that they can depend on. Not everything is within a community or country's control. However, A lot of this results from global and neighboring countries' globalization. American decisions affect our country greatly. They have probably the biggest influence on our nation that way. And more recently, the decisions of the globe's environmentally brainwashed movement. Greta would be a good example of this. And that has hurt our industry as well. And having a prime minister who is so brainwashed and convinced of this because he wants his seat in the UN, that he won't stand up for Canadians in this and is going to implement carbon tax and all that. That's going to make it harder for our farming sectors as well as our oil and gas sectors. History tells us of mistakes that were made in this regard, but also tells us of successes. It provides educational opportunities in what not to do as well as what to do. Listening to these lessons can guide Canada through economic struggle to help make Canada prosperous again. This does require governments that will listen. Our government cares not what happens in the West, which has made recovery, which the West is working on their own, but has made it more challenging. All levels of government should assist areas that are struggling, not ignoring one half of the country to help one province, Quebec, that has had its struggles. The whole country needs to be economically stable to lower unemployment rates and the rates of poverty. If we continue to have governments that ignore this, Canada will be led into further disaster. Working together to come up with a solution for the country as a whole, united we stand, unify the West.
Remember to like and subscribe.